The sweltering May of 1833 settled over Florida Territory's northern coast, with a heat so oppressive it seemed to liquefy the very air. The sun beating down relentlessly on the cotton fields and timber operations that were rapidly transforming the territory's landscape as American settlers flooded into lands recently seized from the Seminole people, creating a frontier version of slavery that combined the brutality of established plantation systems with the lawlessness and violence that characterized regions where legal structures remained incomplete, and where distance from centers of authority meant that cruelty could be exercised with even less restraint than in states where at least minimal social surveillance sometimes provided modest checks on the worst excesses of individual slaveholders. In the slave quarters of Magnolia Bluff Plantation, situated along the St. Johns River where the waterway served as both transportation route and natural boundary between the expanding American settlements and the territories still contested by Seminole resistance, field workers gathered in the evening darkness when temperatures finally dropped to merely unbearable levels, and spoke in voices that carried both the profound skepticism born from lives spent learning that hope was a dangerous luxury and something that might have been the most cautious whisper of possibility about an extraordinary purchase that had been completed 6 weeks earlier at the St. Augustine slave market. According to local legend, what had transpired that April morning violated every pattern they had observed across years of watching how Florida Territory's new planter class made decisions about acquiring the human property that their operations depended upon, suggesting possibilities that seemed too improbable to trust yet too specific in their details, and too consistently reported across multiple witnesses to dismiss entirely as mere wishful fantasy, constructed to make unbearable circumstances slightly more psychologically tolerable through dreams of deliverance that bitter experience had taught them reality would inevitably and cruelly destroy. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 16 months would become a story whispered not merely as another chronicle of suffering endured, but as compelling evidence that even within Florida Territory, where slavery was being established in its most raw and unrestrained form, where the absence of established social hierarchies and the proximity to contested territories created conditions of particular brutality and lawlessness, unexpected alliances could nevertheless form between people whom every social convention insisted must remain forever separated, creating possibilities for resistance and liberation that demonstrated slavery's fundamental vulnerability when moral conviction combined with strategic intelligence, geographic knowledge, and the kind of sustained courage that understood both the enormous risks involved and the even greater moral costs of remaining complicit in a system whose evil was undeniable to anyone willing to acknowledge what they witnessed daily. Florida Territory's northern coast in the early 1830s represented American slavery in one of its most violent and unstable manifestations, a region where the institution was being rapidly imposed upon a landscape recently conquered through military campaigns against the Seminole people who had offered refuge to fugitives for decades, where new plantations were being carved from wilderness by enslaved labor working under conditions that combined the brutality of agricultural slavery with the additional dangers of frontier life, including disease, conflicts with displaced indigenous populations, and the absence of even the minimal legal protections that more established regions occasionally provided. St. Augustine, the territory's oldest settlement dating to Spanish colonial times, served as the principal slave market for the region, operating with a volume that grew rapidly as American planters flooded into the territory seeking land and fortunes, processing hundreds of people annually in transactions that sustained both the city's revival under American rule and the new plantations spreading along rivers and coastlines throughout the territory. The market in St. Augustine functioned with the same systematic brutality that characterized such institutions throughout the South, though with distinctive features that reflected Florida's position as a territory rather than a state, where legal structures remained incomplete, and where the absence of established social hierarchies meant that nouveau riche planters from other states could recreate themselves as aristocrats without the constraints that older societies imposed on behavior and treatment of enslaved workers. Auctioneers reduced human lives to commercial calculations with language that treated conscious beings as equipment, whose value could be determined through formulas assigning dollar amounts to muscles and bones, while studiously ignoring the humanity of those being transformed into property through legal rituals that the territorial government had imported wholesale from states whose systems it sought to replicate. The legal structures governing Florida Territory slavery in 1833 were comprehensive despite the territory's recent acquisition. with slave codes adapted from neighboring states that forbade enslaved people from learning to read, restricted their movement, prohibited unsupervised gathering, and created frameworks designed to make resistance both impossible and futile. Yet the territory's geography and incomplete settlement created practical complications that made absolute surveillance more difficult than in established plantation regions. Vast areas remained unsettled wilderness. Waterways provided potential escape routes, and the proximity to territories still contested by Seminole resistance meant that fugitives who reached those areas might find refuge that was impossible in states where every square mile was claimed and monitored by slaveholding interests. Free Black people existed in St. Augustine and scattered settlements throughout the territory, remnants of the Spanish colonial period when different legal traditions had created more complex categories of status. Though American rule was systematically working to eliminate these complications and to impose the stark binary of enslaved versus free that characterized slavery in the United States. Into this world of frontier brutality and incomplete legal structures, of rapid plantation expansion and violent displacement of indigenous peoples, of comprehensive controls confronting geographic realities that made absolute surveillance impossible, came two people whose encounter would reveal that even apparently unified marriages could conceal profound moral disagreements, and that such disagreements could manifest in actions that violated every expectation about how white women in slaveholding households were supposed to relate to the people whose labor made their material existence possible. Stories passed down through generations claim that the April morning in 1833, when Benjamin and Elizabeth Whitaker attended the St. Augustine slave market began with a conversation that had been occurring with mounting frequency over recent months. A discussion about Magnolia Bluff's labor requirements and the decisions that the plantation's rapid expansion seemed to demand if the estate was to achieve the kind of productivity that would justify Benjamin's substantial investment in Florida land and establish the family's position within the territory's emerging planter elite. Benjamin had concluded that achieving his ambitious production goals required purchasing multiple additional workers beyond the 20 people he had brought with him when relocating from South Carolina. Acquisitions that would strain his capital, but that he considered essential if Magnolia Bluff was to become one of the territory's premier cotton operations, and if the Whitaker family was to achieve the social standing he believed their South Carolina pedigree entitled them to claim. He had come to St. Augustine that morning, intending to purchase at least 5 strong young workers who could provide years of productive labor, while he established the plantation's operations and expanded cultivation into the hundreds of acres he had claimed along the St. John's River, making calculations about expected productivity that treated human beings as investments whose returns could be projected across anticipated years of service. But Elizabeth had insisted on accompanying him to St. Augustine despite his suggestion that she remain at Magnolia Bluff, ostensibly because she needed to purchase various household supplies and visit with acquaintances in the city. And her presence would transform the day's events in ways that neither could have anticipated. According to oral histories preserved among the networks that assisted fugitives and among enslaved communities that maintained careful unofficial records, the morning's transactions proceeded according to Benjamin's plans through the initial stages, with him successfully purchasing 4 field workers, people in their late teens and 20s whose physical condition suggested they might survive Florida's brutal conditions for perhaps 6 to 8 years if they possessed unusual constitution. But when the auctioneer brought a man named Bakari to the block, 7 feet and 8 inches tall, with a physique suggesting tremendous physical strength combined with a bearing that even the market's degrading rituals couldn't suppress. Described by the auctioneer as someone who had been sold 3 times in 5 years because previous owners found him resistant to proper discipline, despite his obvious capacity for heavy labor. Something shifted in the dynamic between Benjamin and Elizabeth that would alter not just that day's events, but the fundamental nature of their relationship. Elizabeth had watched the morning's earlier purchases with visible discomfort that Benjamin had noticed but attributed to feminine sensibility about the market's brutal atmosphere. But when she saw Bakari standing on that platform, when she heard the auctioneer's descriptions that barely concealed brutal treatment behind euphemisms about management difficulties, when she observed the intelligence and unbroken dignity in his bearing despite visible scars testifying to savage attempts to force submission, Elizabeth made a decision that years of marriage had given no indication she possessed the capacity to make. She turned to Benjamin and told him in a voice carrying an authority he had never heard from her regarding plantation matters that they would purchase this man, that regardless of whatever other acquisitions he intended to make, This particular purchase was one she was insisting upon, with an intensity that communicated her demand was non-negotiable. Benjamin's response combined shock at his wife's unprecedented interference in matters that were exclusively his responsibility, anger at what seemed like deliberate undermining of his careful planning, and bewilderment about what she could possibly hope to accomplish by insisting on purchasing someone whose history suggested he would create exactly the kind of management problems that frontier plantations could not tolerate. He told her the suggestion made no economic sense, that establishing a new plantation in frontier territory required workers who would submit completely to brutal discipline, that purchasing someone described as resistant to authority would create operational problems that would require either selling him at a loss or subjecting him to escalating violence that might destroy expensive property. But Elizabeth's insistence was unyielding in ways that transcended disagreement to communicate she was acting on convictions she considered more fundamental than his authority or their economic interests. She told him that if he would not bid, she would use inheritance from her family that she had brought into their marriage to make the purchase independently. That this was a line she was drawing about what she would tolerate in her name. She made clear she recognized the economic irrationality of her demand, but that there were moral considerations she could no longer ignore. Faced with an ultimatum delivered before other planters observing this unprecedented public disagreement, Benjamin bid on Bakari with mounting resentment, but also with wary recognition that his wife of 14 years was revealing aspects of her character their marriage had never exposed. He competed against two other bidders and finally secured Bakari for $2,000, an extraordinary sum for someone whose history suggested commercial problems. As they completed the purchase and arranged for Bakari to be transported to Magnolia Bluff, Benjamin demanded explanations for behavior he found both incomprehensible and threatening. But Elizabeth declined to provide details that would satisfy his questions, speaking instead about moral obligations in language so general it seemed designed to avoid revealing whatever purposes motivated her insistence. What Benjamin did not know, what Elizabeth's careful discretion had concealed, was that his wife had been conducting a quiet campaign of resistance against slavery's brutalities that manifested in ways he never noticed, because he assumed her household management reflected conventional motivations rather than moral convictions that would have alarmed him profoundly. Elizabeth had grown up in a Charleston family, whose Presbyterian faith emphasized divine justice and human accountability in ways that created tensions with slaveholding. And she had inherited from her mother a conviction that slavery violated fundamental Christian principles, even as social realities made open opposition seem impossible. When she married Benjamin and moved with him to Florida Territory, Elizabeth had hoped that the frontier environment might provide opportunities to influence the kind of slavery established in this new region, that perhaps the absence of entrenched traditions might allow for more humane practices. But she had quickly recognized that frontier slavery was, if anything, more brutal than established systems, that the absence of even minimal social constraints meant that violence could be exercised with terrifying freedom, and that Benjamin's ambitions were leading him to create a plantation regime as harsh as any she had witnessed in South Carolina. This recognition had led Elizabeth to begin taking covert actions, using her authority over household operations to create small spaces of relative safety without directly challenging Benjamin's ultimate control. She taught household servants to read despite territorial laws forbidding literacy. She maintained careful contacts with the remnant Spanish and free Black communities in St. Augustine, whose legal traditions created complicated categories of status that American rule was systematically eliminating, but that still provided potential networks of assistance. Most significantly, Elizabeth had been learning about the territory's geography and about routes toward territories still contested by Seminole resistance, understanding that Florida's unique circumstances created escape possibilities that didn't exist in more settled regions. When she saw Bakari on that auction block, when she heard descriptions of his repeated resistance, when she observed the unbroken spirit his bearing communicated, Elizabeth recognized someone marked for destruction through escalating violence or sale to even worse conditions. In that moment, she made a decision that she would use whatever resources her position provided to help this man not just survive, but escape to freedom, regardless of risks to her security and regardless of how Benjamin would react if he discovered the truth. Bakari arrived at Magnolia Bluff on an April evening when the heat and humidity already presaged the brutal summer to come, and when the plantation's rhythms were governed by the demands of establishing cotton cultivation on recently cleared land. Benjamin assigned Bakari immediately to the hardest work available, clearing virgin forest under conditions that combined brutal heat with dangers from snakes and other wildlife, moving massive timber through swampland, performing labor designed to break spirits through exhaustion and fear. But what Benjamin did not observe was that Elizabeth began finding ways to communicate with Bakari that appeared routine but served concealed purposes. She would bring food and water to workers, a practice Benjamin viewed as prudent property maintenance, but that gave Elizabeth opportunities to speak with Bakari where conversations could be disguised. She assigned him occasional maintenance work near the main house. Labor his strength suited, but that created opportunities for exchanges. Most crucially, she ensured he had responsibilities requiring boat travel along the St. Johns River to collect supplies, journeys that gave him knowledge of waterways that could prove essential. Through carefully orchestrated interactions over many months, Elizabeth communicated information that Bakari received with profound wariness. She told him she opposed slavery morally, that she maintained contacts who could assist those seeking freedom, that she would help him escape when circumstances permitted. She explained that Florida's unique situation, with contested territories nearby where Seminole communities had historically offered refuge to fugitives, created possibilities that didn't exist in more settled regions. Bakari listened skeptically, but recognized this might be his only chance. The summer and fall of 1833 brought careful mutual assessment. Elizabeth worked to prove her assistance was genuine, while Bakari tested her claims. She began providing specific information about routes through Florida's wilderness toward territories still contested by Seminole resistance, sharing knowledge about American military patrol patterns, explaining which waterways might provide passage. She gave him access to maps showing the territory's geography, resources her education allowed her to possess, but that would mean severe punishment for any enslaved person discovered with them. Most significantly, Elizabeth accumulated resources necessary for escape: food for extended wilderness travel, clothing suitable for varied conditions, weapons for protection in territory where wildlife and potential conflicts created dangers, and most crucially, information about how to potentially make contact with Seminole communities who might offer refuge. By winter of 1834, preparations moved toward implementation. Benjamin needed to travel to Tallahassee for extended territorial government business, commitments that would keep him away for at least a month and leave Elizabeth in practical control. She communicated that Bakari should prepare to attempt escape during this window. The plan involved Bakari leaving on what would appear a routine errand to a neighboring plantation, then continuing into the wilderness using routes Elizabeth had mapped, carrying resources she provided, attempting to reach territories where Seminole communities might offer refuge, or where the absence of American control created spaces where fugitives could potentially survive. The opportunity came in February 1834, during the second week after Benjamin's departure, when weather conditions seemed favorable. Elizabeth arranged for Bakari to deliver items to a plantation several miles away, but also provided him with food, weapons, detailed maps, and information about potential routes toward contested territories. Their final conversation acknowledged both his gratitude for unexpected assistance and recognition that she was taking extraordinary risks. Bakari left Magnolia Bluff on a February morning, traveled to the neighboring plantation as instructed to establish his departure's legitimacy, then continued into Florida's wilderness, using knowledge Elizabeth had provided and his own resourcefulness to navigate terrain that was dangerous, but that offered possibilities for those desperate enough and prepared enough to attempt survival beyond American settlements. What happened to Bakari in subsequent months and years remains largely undocumented and perhaps unknowable. Some oral traditions claim he successfully reached territories controlled by Seminole communities and found refuge there, potentially joining the Black Seminoles who had created their own settlements and who would resist American attempts at conquest and forced removal for years. Others suggest he survived in wilderness areas between American and Seminole territories, perhaps eventually making his way further south or finding means to reach territories outside Florida entirely. The truth, whatever it was, disappeared into the deliberate silence that characterized survival for those who escaped slavery in frontier regions where official records were incomplete and where successful flight meant vanishing so completely that even rumors of one's survival were dangerous. Back at Magnolia Bluff, Elizabeth managed aftermath with carefully prepared performance, expressing surprise when Bakari failed to return and suggesting explanations ranging from becoming lost in wilderness to animal attack to simple flight. When Benjamin returned to discover the acquisition his wife had insisted upon had vanished, his anger combined financial loss, bewilderment about her original insistence, and fury at having lost expensive property. He organized searches and offered rewards, contacted military authorities and other planters. But in frontier territory with vast unsettled areas and proximity to contested territories, the trail went cold almost immediately. Whether Benjamin ever suspected Elizabeth's role remains uncertain. If doubts emerged, he never voiced them publicly, perhaps because accusation would require acknowledging possibilities that would fundamentally destabilize their marriage and his authority. Elizabeth maintained careful discretion for the remainder of her life, understanding revelation could endanger both herself and others. The financial loss combined with other challenges of frontier plantation life eventually forced Benjamin to moderate his expansion plans, though Magnolia Bluff survived and eventually prospered. The impact rippled through enslaved communities throughout Florida territory in ways official records never captured, but oral traditions preserved as evidence that freedom remained achievable even in frontier slavery. For enslaved people throughout the region, the story became proof that careful planning with unexpected assistance could overcome surveillance, and that Florida's unique circumstances, wilderness areas, contested territories, indigenous communities who had historically offered refuge, created possibilities that didn't exist in more settled regions. And sometimes, according to legends communities preserved, that resistance stood 7 feet 8 inches tall, purchased at a wife's insistence not to be exploited but to be saved, assisted by a planter's wife whose moral convictions led her to violate every expectation and whose strategic courage created possibilities the system insisted could never exist. Bakari's journey from St. Augustine's auction block to potential freedom in Florida's contested territories lasted barely 10 months from purchase to escape. But his story became enduring proof that freedom was achievable through intelligence and courage and unexpected alliance. That moral conviction could lead people to risk everything to help others escape bondage, and that even in frontier regions where slavery was being established in its most brutal form, human dignity and the yearning for liberty could never be completely suppressed, and that the institution's claims of absolute control were always vulnerable to those brave enough and prepared enough to challenge them.